There we go. So, hi everyone, and thank you for joining the Title IX office tonight for another event hosted in October, which October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And a large part of Domestic Violence Awareness Month is understanding trauma, whether you as an individual has experienced it personally, secondhand, so on and so forth. So, tonight we have a special guest that's going to talk to us about experiencing trauma, understanding trauma, to really cover not only the short-term effects of trauma, but the long-term effects, and to define it for us, right? Because sometimes we don't know what trauma looks like, and really the different mechanisms, defense mechanisms that our brain goes through when we are experiencing some kind of trauma or shock experience. So my name is Zaisha Nadler. I use she, her, and hers pronouns. I'm very happy to have you all with us today as the Violence Prevention, Education, and Outreach Coordinator. And then I'm also going to just introduce our special guest today. So today we have Portia Allie-Turco, who is a faculty member and the clinic director at SUNY Plattsburgh. Her clinical and research interests include the treatment of historical, generational, and interpersonal trauma, and facilitating culturally sustaining interventions in the delivery of mental health treatment for BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. So thank you, Portia, for joining us tonight for this very important event. And I'll allow you to introduce yourself as well.
All right, thank you so much, Saisha, and hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. I'm going to be presenting a really information-dense presentation tonight. We have a lot to learn about trauma. So my hope is that you will engage us, you'll have questions. You feel free to also use the chat box if you have anything that you'd like to say to me, or if you have any questions. I will pause midway just to make sure that all the information is clear. And of course, my contact information will be available. If you want to email me, I would be glad to set up some time to talk about this and discuss our understanding of trauma. So overall, my goal is three things actually tonight. I'm looking at helping you all understand what trauma is. I'm going to be looking at what the stress response will do to the body and the brain, and then also unpacking some of those impacts of trauma, and also looking at how do we help people who have been impacted by trauma. Furthermore, we're going to be looking at some brain and body-based responses to stress. We're going to look at recognizing the effects of trauma, and then also applying our knowledge to regular everyday life. So what is trauma? So when I say trauma, what does everybody think? So I'd like to hear from all of you. What is trauma? So if I said trauma, what is it? What do you think? What comes to mind?
I can jump in here first.
Jump in. I see some people on the presentation tonight, so I'd like to hear their voices.
Yeah, so I know for me, my understanding and level and knowledge of trauma has definitely shockingly grown in experience. Before, I used to have that notion that trauma had to be like an extreme, like the gun against someone's head, where like your whole life has changed. And now I'm really learning how we can remember subconsciously things that happened to us as children. So any shock values of experiences that we may have that may have been negative in a lot of ways that we really hold with us.
Absolutely, that's really well said, Zaisha. So when we look at trauma, we're looking at what we call the 3 E's, right? We're looking for an event or a series of events or circumstances that an individual may have experienced that are physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And those experiences or events tend to have long-lasting effects. What I want to highlight is that you don't necessarily have to have been present. Just the knowledge that somebody else has experienced this can also create a trauma. So for instance, if your loved one went through something like this and you hear about it, that too can traumatize you, right? Another part that we want to look at are the various different types of traumas. So we're looking at natural disasters, hurricanes, fires, floods. We may be looking at human-caused disasters. These might be environmental disasters. We might be looking at terrorism. We might be looking at community violence like robberies, drive-by shootings, gang-related violence. And then we might look at school violence. This can be threats or bullying or school shootings. We might also actually have racial incidences or the death of a student or a faculty or staff member. Another part that we look at when we look at the types of trauma is we're looking at what we call family trauma. This might be abuse, it might be neglect, it might even be witnessing somebody else be abused in the family. Maybe this is domestic violence. You might be looking at a family member who's incarcerated. You might be looking at substance abuse or somebody in the family who dies in various different ways, maybe unexpectedly. Another part that we look at is refugee and immigrant trauma. You know, in light of everything that's been happening this year, we've heard a lot about children. We've looked at families that have been separated. So this can be a trauma of sorts to families being displaced like that. We're looking at exposure to war. We're looking at political violence. We know that we've been watching and supporting the protests. We're looking at some of that. So that can be a trauma. Witnessing so Black and brown people being injured, looking at media images of that, that can be a trauma. Medical trauma can also happen where perhaps somebody experiences an invasive medical procedure. Some people go through various types of cancers, a cancer treatment, that can be a trauma. And then another part that we often forget that actually is a trauma is poverty, living in poverty, a lack of resources, a lack of supportive networks, homelessness, that's another version and another type of trauma. So when we look at trauma in the therapy world, we look at what we call type 1, 2, and 3 trauma. So type 1 trauma would be those traumas that we call single incident traumas. So this is something perhaps that happened once to you, and maybe it didn't happen again, but it's pretty significant. This might be exposure to a car accident, right? That's a single type 1 trauma. Then we have something else called complex trauma. Complex trauma is pretty pervasive in somebody's life in that it tends to be multiple different exposures to a traumatic event that begins in childhood, and it has lifelong implications, right? So when we look at another type of trauma, this is a trauma that a lot of BIPOC individuals experience, where we look at historical trauma. So this is cumulative. Typically, historical trauma is also generational. So multiple different generations experience this. Examples of that are what's happened to Native American communities through slavery, Holocaust survivors, LGBTQ plus communities, and Japanese American internment camps. So all of those are what we call historical trauma. So those events have happened, they're over, but the effects and the implications of that are still experienced today by people who were not there necessarily at that time, but generationally, they still feel that, they still go through that. So that would be examples of historical trauma. So another kind of trauma that we often forget about that I like to highlight is racial trauma, right? Once again, we see a trauma that's being experienced by BIPOC individuals and communities where this is cumulative, this is chronic, this is lifelong, everyday experiences with racial harassment, microaggressions, implicit bias, where discrimination both at individual, community, and institutional levels. So in counseling, we look at that from what we call a micro perspective, so maybe individual to individual. We're looking at it at a macro level, maybe community-wide, and then what we call the meso level. This is now policies of our institutions and how they're written about different racial minorities. So another piece that I'd like everybody's attention to be drawn to is what we call the ACEs. This is an amazing study that was conducted, medical study actually, that was trying to trace the implications of trauma and tie them up with different physiological health conditions. So what they found is that actually 2 in 3 children or youth are exposed to violence or ACEs, that a lot, one in 5 adults have been exposed to adverse childhood experiences. So all of these experiences might be physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, neglect, substance abuse, mental illness, violence. but those tend to impact your lifespan. They predispose you to cancer, to health conditions, to diabetes. And of course, as we can see this during COVID times, we see that a lot of our minority communities, especially the Black community, we start to see some of the health implications of trauma, right? So if people were really second guessing the idea that trauma is physiologically linked, we're actually seeing that right now. We have proof that those are the community, our Latinx community, our Black communities, they're the most impacted by COVID, and also our Native American communities. So this is really confirming the ACEs study. So how do we respond to trauma or stress? So I'd like us to look at a video. So this video will explain something that's called the freeze response. I highlight the freeze response because typically we're familiar with what we call the fight response. This is where the physiological body is gearing you up for fighting a threat, right? Where you get that adrenaline, you get that energy in your body, your muscles are ready to move, you're ready for attack. And the flight response is that a response where you want to run away from a threat, where your body physiologically responds by wanting to run. Most of us are not familiar with the freeze response. And the freeze response, I think, as I've seen it in counseling, it tends to be really marginalized and stigmatized. This is where we engage in a lot of victim blaming, where we tend to not support people about their trauma and how they responded. So I'm going to show a small clip of the freeze response. I think this is going to do a great job of explaining what it is and how perhaps we might think about it differently.
Oops, not sure if you're sharing your sound from your computer.
Okay, let me pause. Let me do that for a minute, everybody. So bear with me. Let me just share my sound. There we go. Thank
I
you.
feel like it should be something automatic on Zoom.
I think so too. All right, you let me know now if you can hear it.
Up behind me and swiped his hand up my butt and then said things in a menacing way, but in a foreign language. And do you know what my response was? I said, "I'm sorry," as if my butt had somehow forced his hand to grope it. Now, that response makes no logical sense, but in the light of the Me Too movement, people are asking, why didn't she speak up? Or why didn't I fight back? Or why didn't I resist? And when 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys have been sexually assaulted, but the vast majority of them did nothing in the moment, they froze up, we as a society have to understand the freeze response if we're going to understand sexual assault. Every single survivor of sexual assault that I have met with in therapy froze during the assault. And most submitted and most felt shame. 1 in 4 of your Facebook friends has been sexually assaulted. Please share this video as one of them may need to hear this to forgive themselves. You may think of freezing up as just inaction, but it is much, much deeper than that. These are instincts that are deeply hardwired into our brain's survival center. We've been taught that we need to say no, to resist, to escape. But so often, victims feel paralyzed to do so. One survivor said, "We're told that we need to respect ourselves enough to fight back." But that was the mystery to me. I did respect myself, but I could never bring myself to literally say the word no or fight back. My voice always just seemed to shrink away as my body went limp. Worse yet, sometimes I found myself smiling, hoping that by encouraging these behaviors in the moment, I could cooperate myself out of the situation. Just play along until you can escape, I thought. Not fighting back, not saying no, is not a form of consent or participation in a sexual act. It's actually your brain's most desperate attempt at survival. When we talk about our brain taking over in dangerous situations, we often talk about the fight or flight response. But the reaction, the freeze response, doesn't get much attention. This response is the result of our ancient brain flipping a switch, turning off our logic, turning off our thinking, and switching to the one and only option that is left to save our lives: freezing. So let's look at this in nature for a second. Here's an example of a duck that is completely immobile in the presence of a much larger animal, a dog. And when the dog looks away, the duck's able to escape with its life. Now, the survivor that I quoted previously said this: "As a scientist, I conducted experiments on the stress response of birds. One phenomenon I've seen over and over is something called tonic immobility. We would trap these birds, handle them extensively, and put colorful bands on their legs to mark them. Now, understandably, all this could severely stress the bird, but when we released them, they usually didn't try to fight back or escape. We would carefully place them on the ground, and often they would lay just like that, perfectly immobile, for several minutes before flying freely away. These birds' survival instincts overpowered their physical ability to fly away. They were stuck in freeze mode because their ancient instinctual brain decided that was the safest option." So this tonic immobility literally means that your brain turns off your muscles' ability to react in order to keep you alive. So why does sexual assault elicit a survival response? Rape and sexual assault isn't about sex. It's about power and control and dominance. Rape has been used as a tool of war through history to submit the populace to the invaders. It happened in World War II, in the rape of Nanking, and the Russian army entering Germany, and many, many more wars through the history of the world. And if a woman who was being assaulted by an invading soldier fought back, she would probably just be killed. There was little hope of fleeing. Freezing, submitting, cooperating were her best hopes of survival. And our anciently evolved brain knows that better than we can realize. In our modern culture of sexual harassment and assault, these reactions don't seem to function too well. But our ancient brain still defaults to these survival responses during threats. In 2001, there was a study on college-aged women in which subjects were asked highly inappropriate questions in a job interview setting. For example, do you wear bras to work? Do you find yourself sexually desirable? Their results show that gap between what we think we should or would do and our actions in the moment. So each of the women had previously said that if they were to be sexually harassed, they would respond by being confrontational, by leaving, by reporting it. But when it actually happened, not a single one of them reacted as they had imagined they would. Instead, the researchers saw a startling response in the video recordings of these interactions. The women sat patiently and answered the questions while smiling. Now, whether you find this validating or horrifying, another study showed 70% of sexual assault victims reported significant tonic immobility, and only around 5% of rape victims file a police report. And that's because speaking up is dangerous. Society shames them, their boss may fire them, romantic partners may shun them. But this freeze response isn't logical or planned. It's a reflex, an instinct, and a physiological reaction that's triggered by high-stress situations. Even if we wanted to scream or yell or kick, our brain ensures that our muscles are frozen because millions of years of evolution say that freezing is the safest response.
Okay, I'm going to stop there, everybody. Any questions so far? Any thoughts?
And it's incredibly difficult.
Hang on.
Makes no.
There we go. I just want to show a little bit about the different parts of the brain. So in the brain, when we're looking at the stress response, we have what's called, this is the prefrontal cortex. The front of the brain is our thinking brain. And then the deep structures inside here, that's the emotional brain. This is where the spinal cord leads. This is the back All of those are what we call the emotional or limbic brains. Our limbic brain is not rational. The goal of the limbic brain is to keep you alive. So at whatever cost, when your brain senses the threat is imminent, it'll shut off your thinking brain, and so you'll react. Some of the common reactions when we go into that fight, flight, to freeze, so you might see somebody who's been through maybe a traumatic situation, and you see them yelling, you see them swearing and shouting and appearing really aggressive. This is the brain's way of trying to protect itself. They're fighting for survival, right? The flight response might be running away, but then again, here we go. What we might miss is that avoidance behavior. So avoidance behavior in people who are traumatized can actually look like depression. This is where they don't want to leave the house. Maybe they don't want to get out of bed. Maybe they start using substances. So this is something else to be considering. The freeze response is numbing, looking numb, feeling disconnected, looking confused. A lot of the time, somebody who's in shock might look like they spaced out, like they don't feel anything. So this is the freeze response. Another part that we want to be looking at when we think about stress and trauma is that trauma overwhelms, right? The traumatic experience overwhelms your system. And so it shuts it down. It sends this alarm bell that goes off that says there's a threat coming, so turn everything off. The brain doesn't need us thinking, being reasonable, finding a sense of humor when there's a threat coming. So the most important thing that it does is it shuts off everything that's not considered essential. So what that means is if you are living in a threatening, traumatic situation, your body will shut down your digestion, it'll shut down your logic, it'll shut down your reasoning, it'll shut down all of those things that are not necessary for survival. But then again, think about it, what happens if you are in school and your front of your brain where you use your logic doesn't work anymore? Right? So that's why trauma is so impactful. So triggers, another part that we might see in somebody who's traumatized is they might have reminders of the experience. So when you get a trigger, your body reacts as if it's still happening. That's a major thing to somebody who's traumatized. So they get set off really easily, right? So the experiences they get frequent reminders. So a trigger can be something as simple as a loud noise. It might be somebody touching you unexpectedly. It might be chaos, things that are chaotic. So it might be particular spaces. It might be different smells. It might be watching something on TV and then it reminds you of what happened. I know that a lot of BIPOC people feel like emergency vehicles are a trauma and they get triggered easily by hearing the sirens, hearing the sounds. It might be different times of the year, maybe the change in season. If your trauma happened in the fall, the change in season might be a trigger for you. So some common responses might be fear. You might see somebody's anxiety really go up. They might start to really worry. You might notice shame and guilt. You hear a lot of self-blame. I should have done something. I can't believe I didn't do anything. You might notice somebody who's always sick, right? So trauma response and trauma in the body reduces your immune system. So experiences of trauma tend to decrease your body's ability to fight infection and disease. So when you look at, once again, when you look at who's getting sick during COVID, it starts to make sense, right? It's people who have lived under trauma. So nightmares can be another feature, difficulty sleeping, concentrating, or angry outbursts, aggression or withdrawing, right? So over and under reactions are also common. So where you see somebody in a scary situation, but they don't react at all. So that's another indication of trauma, where people just stop being worried about things that they need to be worried about. So the impact of exposure to trauma, everybody, means that the body is always engaged, the brain is engaged to fight, to flee or to freeze. So your body is always in survival mode. When your body is in survival mode, it lends itself to injury. You get hurt easily. You might be more impulsive. It may be difficult to actually think about the future. So in counseling, we may see these people tend to get into risky situations because their level of fear sometimes gets disoriented. It's easy for them to engage and get hurt because their threshold is very high. That's what we call the window of tolerance in counseling, where people who are traumatized sometimes can handle more, and they get into situations that get them into more trauma because their reactions to stressful events decreases, right? So another impact of trauma besides the headaches and stomach aches is poor appetite. You might see somebody whose self-care declines. Maybe they don't shower as much. Maybe this is somebody who used to be really well turned out, but they don't do that anymore. You might notice that they have a hard time controlling their reactions and emotions. You might notice them withdrawing from other people. Like I said, risky behavior, high risk behavior tends to increase. You might notice that they don't trust or build relationships with other people. You might notice that paying attention and learning is impacted. Maybe this is somebody who stops wanting to go to class. They don't want to do homework. They become absent from school. This is somebody who might have really enjoyed doing work, but they don't do it anymore or turn it in, and they have failing grades. Something else that I've seen is maybe they fall asleep in class. They're falling asleep. They're not interacting with other people, so they've isolated themselves. They might be at increased risk for substance abuse and depression. They look like they're not managing. So they get a lot of that, the feelings of shame and guilt, and maybe fear, a lot of fear. So before I get into offering support, I'm going to stop for a minute to see if people have any questions or are posting any questions in the chat. Any thoughts for us?
I think even also to those who are joining us, if it's reminding you of anything, or if you've seen these signs as well, feel free to share. You don't have to obviously out yourself, but use hypotheticals. Because I know listening to this, and of course, like I've done some research on trauma and things of that nature, but even every time I hear avoidance, I'm like, well, yes, I do that. And seeing how common like avoidance is, and especially for those of us who work in systems of higher education, seeing how many of our students are like, we always talk about FOMO, the fear of missing out, and how many of them are like always on their phone. And from some aspects, their phone is an escape from their trauma too. So always trying to explain that to, those who are older and elders can be difficult trying to explain traumas. But really, I think this is a great conversation, but I want to open it up to everyone else as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts, everybody? I think for me, something else that I'm quite concerned about most recently in light of everything that's happened this year is the racial battle fatigue, right? So when we look at minoritized individuals and the battle for equality and equity, so when we look at some of the implications of that, so right now I'm doing a lot of work with specifically Black women, and really that concept that Black women are angry. And what does that mean? That we look at them and we identify the anger without really understanding that the anger is hurt.
Yep.
Right? So really being able to unpack anger, that anger reaction, as being a hurt reaction. So I'm fascinated by that. I'm really curious at how can we frame that in a way that makes sense when we look at historically, this goes way back, right? It starts from slavery days. So all the way. And when you start to understand the legacies of that kind of historical and generational trauma, some of the behaviors that we might see today make sense.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about how do we support somebody? So let's go back to that. So I think for me, the most important piece that I would share would be to make time for this person and check in with them. I think what I've seen is that people tend to get rushed to move on. We're really big on getting people to move on, but we want to be able to create a space where strong feelings can be shared, that people can really be validated for having emotions and having strong emotions. and not taking it personally. So being able to reassure them that, you know, you've gone through something that is really deeply disturbing and that's painful, and offering practical support. That's another element to trauma. And I think for me, clinically in therapy, looking at how do we offer both emotional support, but also practical support. Sometimes people feel like the beginning is just giving me something to eat, checking somebody's eating. Can I help you clean something? Can I do your laundry? You know, supporting people in self-care, like eating healthy. Sometimes when people are traumatized, they don't want to eat. And the reason is when you are under threat, your body shuts down your digestive system. So you produce what we call cortisol in the stomach. So that cortisol long-term takes away your appetite, but it's actually not good for your health, right? So we want to get them eating maybe small amounts, do a lot of hydration. We want to encourage exercise because exercise is really fascinating. If you look at exercise, your brain interprets exercise as if you escaped, right? Isn't that amazing? So when you engage in running, your brain says, oh, you ran from threat, you should be fine. So it gives you a lot of other chemicals that counteract the trauma response. So you get what the chemical we call serotonin. So serotonin shuts down the stress response. So really engaging in exercise is really helpful. And you know, with exercise, you can do something as simple as going for a walk. You don't need to maybe run a marathon, but something daily walk, you could be helping them with that. Letting people know that you're not going to judge them, that this is a judgment-free zone, can be really helpful. And then allowing them to talk about what happened. Once again, sometimes when people have strong reactions, we're quick to comfort, but to really shut them down, to not talk further, but really allowing them to talk when they get upset, or maybe not insisting that they talk if they don't want to. You may need to leave them alone with their thoughts, but it's important to let them know that you will be there for them when they need you, and reassure them that there's nothing that they can say to you that will scare you away, right? You want to be able to give space that doesn't allow them to isolate. So it's a delicate balance, but just checking in and looking at different options, like what would be helpful. Perhaps reaching out to professionals at some point can really help. Identifying people who are trusted, who can be good resources, is another area that could be helpful. And then things to think about. So really be aware of what you say and do. So most importantly, don't avoid talking about the event. Sometimes people want to focus on the silver lining too quickly. So what I say is try and be aware that you don't use those stock phrases of look at the bright side, look, it could have been worse. So it's okay to validate their strength, but without minimizing the impact of what happened, right? Don't judge the thoughts, really look at how can they cope with the thoughts. What do they need to do to cope? And be really patient with them. So like I said, activities to try for relaxation would be going for walks, looking at meditation. I talked about the value of exercise, and that burns off the stress chemicals and also encourages sleep, right? Exercise helps with sleep. And some low-key activities that people can do. Sometimes it's just checking in and saying, let's play like cards, let's do a board game, let's do a puzzle, really simple things that don't require a lot of effort, and maybe finding some ways to help them smile, maybe looking at like a comedy, checking out some movies that are really easy and light that they don't have to think a lot about, and also the ones that are not going to trigger them, right? I think that when we look at trauma, we want to be looking at a holistic model of support. We want maybe therapeutic intervention if it's needed. We want to be there for the person and validate their feelings. We want to also understand that trauma is a brain-body reaction, right? That trauma starts in the brain's interpretation of a threat, that we get a chemical reaction and that the body will respond in light of that. And that people can get stuck in a trauma reaction because of the triggers that happen. And then also the environment can reinforce the trauma. So really being able to be there and understand all of those different components, right?
Yeah.
So that's my presentation tonight. I don't know if we have any more questions or thoughts. So I'm really keen to hear people's thoughts, even if you want to type them in the chat, that would be welcome.
Yep. If you type them in the chat, I'll read them. So we have one comment. Would you say the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic, quarantine, isolation, cancellations, etc., for some more than others has been / continues to be a traumatic experience? So they were saying that they notice a lot of the signs, lack of sleep being a huge one, outburst, withdrawal from a lot of our first year students, as well as some upper class students. Many assume it's the course load or normal college stressors, but do you think COVID can be related to our current situation?
I absolutely think so. Now, remember that trauma is not the same as PTSD. So you can experience a trauma and not have PTSD, or you can have a trauma that leads to PTSD, right? So PTSD is a diagnosis that comes from somebody who's experienced a trauma, but they get flooded by nightmares. They can't sleep, they can't eat, they feel like they can't function. So trauma is really, a lot of us during COVID are going through a trauma of some sort, right? Because we're being impacted. A lot of us are getting some of that. We know loved ones, we know friends, we know, politically, when we look at what's going on. So we are going through a traumatic time in the country right now, in the world. And therefore, remember that the trauma, when we go through a trauma, the brain's resources, the front of the brain, where learning happens, where thinking happens, is impacted. So people who could carry a 18 credits might find that they really only can do 12 this semester, right? Mm-hmm. So being able to advise like that too. So if you're advising people or you're working with students, really letting them know that you could do 18 before, but maybe you can do 12 now, because this is a lot, right? So that's something to think about.
And that's okay. And so we have another question as well. Is there a such thing, and I think you talked about just the times that we're in, now we're nearing close to an election season. Is there a such thing as political trauma?
Absolutely. And once again, trauma depends on the person. It depends on the environment, the circumstances, their own history. So there is such a thing as political and historical trauma, because don't forget that for a lot, once again, when we look at our BIPOC communities, politics are really closely related to traumatic events historically. So sometimes trauma has a way of reigniting other traumas, right? Especially when traumas have not been resolved. So we do carry the legacy of not being able to resolve traumas in BIPOC communities, right? And there's something else that we call grief, right? We're looking at grief, we call it unresolved grief. That a lot of our BIPOC communities have had traumatic experiences that have not been named, that have not been apologized for, that have not been healed. So when we add more to those communities, we start to see the after effects, right? We can see a lot of that. So definitely political trauma exists, and its impact is on top of all of the other traumas that have happened.
Yeah. And I think we see it the same way you're referencing not being able to, watch the news or wanting to turn off the news. Like, we have a lot of people now, like it can be hard sitting through a debate, or, everyone's now, it's like a pressure to vote in a lot of ways, which I obviously support voting. But for some people, it's a lot of pressure that they're going through. So then another question as well, how can you prevent your trauma, personal trauma that you have, from affecting those around you?
That's a great question too. Well, the most important part is being able to attend to that trauma, right? You need to do some of your own healing, and healing can happen in many ways. Healing can be therapeutic, attending therapy, but also attending to your spiritual, emotional life. Now, spirituality doesn't have to be denominational. It can be, for some people, engaging in a practice like mindfulness. It can be something like meditation. It can be going to church or synagogue or mosque. It can be many different things, but it's about attending to those parts of yourself that will calm down that threat response, right? Because trauma in the body and in the brain is trapped. The experience is trapped as if it's still happening. So it needs resolution. Your thinking brain knows that it's over, Your emotional brain doesn't, because your emotional brain is not logical. So you need to be able to engage in body-based treatments and thinking brain treatments at the same time. So if you are looking to not affect other people, and we say that hurt people hurt others, right? Even if it's not on purpose. So it means you need to attend to yourself, your well-being, your self-care, nutrition, exercise, sleep, and then also thinking about how do you get the help that you need for whatever the trauma is, right? It may mean that you need to engage maybe in group therapy, in individual therapy, in spirituality, and a lot of different practices, and reach out to other people, talk about what happened so that you can find some healing.
I think in some ways you just answered our last question. The last question was, what other outlets would you suggest in dealing with trauma, either of COVID, racial inequality, election, and so much more? So we talked about running, which I mean, I'm not going to run, but I'll walk.
Yeah. Well, we have brave spaces on campus. That's a really great way to promote dialogue. I believe a lot in a concept called racial reconciliation. So I work a lot on that topic, on how do we heal things that maybe have been unnamed. I'm really big on naming things, because I think just even having that experience be vocalized and recognized. Of course, I'm a therapist. I know that the power of the spoken word, just being able to name something out loud to people who can hear it and hold it and listen to it, and validate that. So sometimes validating doesn't mean you have to agree. So when I'm looking at the political divide, I'm thinking we can validate and listen without agreeing. So it doesn't have to be a tug of war. So sometimes it disintegrates that way because of the difficulty in listening, right? So I think we could do that. We can engage socially. People have become really creative about socially engaging. I know the Hub has been sponsoring some things. I know Title IX has been doing, a lot of different offices are sponsoring, so we remain connected that way. And also being able to disconnect if we need that. So making sure that we're not overly connected either, right? That we don't have the ability to calm ourselves down and sleep. So I think that would be a great idea. And like I said, nutrition, sleep, exercise, social connection, talking to other people, maybe reaching out to other people and supporting them, because there's a lot of benefit from doing that too.
Yeah, for sure. And potentially our last question, again, feel free to keep throwing questions in there, everyone. What can supervisors, professors, and other faculty and staff do to support students that are experiencing various types of traumas?
Actually, great questions. Wow, questions are wonderful tonight. So I've been working with faculty actually on what we call trauma-informed pedagogy. So trauma-informed pedagogy outlines some of these things that I'm talking about and translates them into what does it look like in the classroom and outside of the classroom. So if we were to be a trauma-informed school, we would really intuitively would be able to apply some of these things. So if a good example would be if you notice a student who's not attending classes, really being diligent about following up. Look, can I support you? Is there anything you need? Looking at assignments, I'm always in favor during a time like this to really reevaluate assignments and think about the objectives, thinking about the intention, thinking about maybe do we need to give somebody an extension? Maybe this is a lot, maybe they took on a lot of credits. How can we work with them, right? So it's that ability to reach out. So when we look at faculty and staff, I think the first thing is human connection and caring, that relationship. So building a relationship where students feel like you care about them and being able to reach out and being able to show that support. You may not know what to do, but perhaps somebody else does. Perhaps you say, I don't know what to do, but I can reach out with you to Title IX. Maybe they can help us. Or we can reach. So I think that really that human connection, if I were to pick one thing, that's what it would be.
Again, if you have any other questions, keep throwing it in there. Portia, if you have any questions for the audience too, feel free to ask.
Well, I'm thinking about what would it take for perhaps people to engage in their own self-care, So what would they need to be able to engage in that or to commit to a self-care plan? Like what would they need to be able to get into something like that? I think that would be my question.
Great question.
Yeah. So what's stopping that? Yeah, more opportunities.
I think some days, for me, so more opportunities, huge one. But I think this pandemic has showed me our structure in work, and this whole ideal of like a work-life balance doesn't really exist. And, that the 5 hours, 5 days, not 5 hours, 5 days a week can be pretty extensive for a lot of people. So I think really structurally, I think looking at the way that we work so much, and obviously I'm speaking on work because that's most of my life right now, but having these opportunities, and also for our professors, our supervisors, so on and so forth, to really look at the way that their students work, their supervisees work, their colleagues work, and try to do more to better support, whether that's days off as a self-care, being institutionalized, not only here at SUNY Plattsburgh, but just in general everywhere. Just really looking at our systems that better support people as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that you'll find that really the whole world is re-examining that idea.
Yeah.
And perhaps, when we look at it like that, we're coming into that concept that in therapy we call post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is a phenomenal experience that some people who have gone through a trauma, they really grow through that, right? It really teaches them a different way of looking at life, at looking at experiences, and it enriches their perspective going forward. So it's not to say that the trauma was beneficial, but it's how they used what happened to them, right? Some people really grab onto that and they become advocates for other people. They become advocates for a different way of living. So for me, I'm looking at COVID, this time is traumatic for a lot of us, that perhaps there's been some lessons that are happening too, that going forward will change the way we exist and how we live. And so your comment about looking at life-work balance just made me think of that.
Yeah, for sure. Another
Yeah.
comment says taking everything day by day and having
Absolutely.
that push to try new things as well.
Yes, and in mindfulness, there's a concept of one thing at a time too. So it basically says being present right now, right here, and not existing in the future or the past. You can't change the past and the future is not here, because when you focus in either one of these, you miss what's happening in the right now. So when you are a person who's trying to be grounded and healthy, the best place to be is in the right now and choosing what you're going to do. So that's that one step at a time, right? Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Anything else? So thank you everyone again for joining us. As a reminder, this is being recorded. So graciously, our guest speaker, Portia, has agreed. The Title IX office has a YouTube channel where everyone can go and rewatch all of our events from this semester, so that, again, we can continue these conversations. You can share the events with your friends and your loved ones, because as we said, this is a huge conversation we don't have often. We don't talk about traumas, especially generationally. So this is a huge step in introducing. Obviously, we're not going to know trauma overnight, but we do wish that you all continue the conversation and continue looking out. If you did not know, Thursday is Wear Purple Day in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So please wear purple. If not, you can stop by the Title IX office. We have ribbons prepared and made for you to make sure you have your purple on. Hawkins is lit in illuminated purple for the rest of the month. And we still have more events coming within the next 2 weeks. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Portia. I wish everyone a great night.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you.